Having confronted Eliphaz for the second time, Job must now deal with his other two friends. In chapter 18 of the book of Job, Bildad, the Shuhite, replies to Job's argument. He says to Job in verse 2, "When will you end these endless speeches? Be sensible, Job, and then we can talk." Essentially, Bildad says to Job, be like us. Accept what we believe, which is the retribution theology of the book of Proverbs, and then we can talk together. How many of us, like Bildad, choose to respond to other people in the same manner? We may not agree with what they say, we get angry, and we want to say to them, if you would just be like me. If you'd think like me, act like me, talk like me, dress like me, then we'd be able to fellowship together. He goes on and he says, why are we regarded as cattle? Like, Job, why do you think we're nothing less than animals? And considered stupid in your sight? Well, pretty much it's because of how you're treating Job, Bildad. Your own actions are proving that you are rather dumb. But Bildad doesn't get that. So he goes on and he says, you who tear yourself to pieces in your anger, is the earth to be abandoned for your sake? Or must the rocks be moved out of their place just to let you rant and rave against God? He says, no. Verse 5, the lamp of the wicked is snuffed out. The flame of his fire stops burning. Now, that is a very proverb-like belief, that the lamp of the wicked will be snuffed out and the flame of his fire will stop burning. Job is going to argue the exact opposite in a moment. But Bildad goes on. He says, the light of the wicked's tent becomes dark, and the lamp beside him goes out. And then he goes on and he keeps ranting and raving from verses 7 down through 16 of all these things that happen to the wicked man. And in verse 17 he says, the memory of the wicked man perishes out of the earth, and he has no name in the land. So Job, everything you've been saying, all the arguments, all the self-righteous talk, it's going to amount to nothing, because nobody is going to remember you. Nobody is ever going to hear your argument. He goes on and he says, the wicked is driven from light into darkness and is banished from the world. And then he rubs salt into Job's wounds by continuing in verse 19. He says, he has no offspring or descendants among his people, no survivor where he once lived. Oh, Job, you lost your children. You have lost all your servants. They have been killed and taken away. All your descendants are gone. It's because you're a bad person, Job. And then he goes on in verse 21 and he says, Job, this is why all of this has happened to you. Because surely this here is the dwelling of an evil man. This is the place of one who does not know God. Job, you are a heathen. You're a pagan. You do not know the real God. Well, according to Job, this is because God chooses not to reveal himself to us. Job responds to Bildad in chapter 19. He says to Bildad, "How long will you torment me? How long will you crush me with your words? 10 times now you have reproached me. Shamelessly you attack me. If it is true that I have gone astray, my error remains my concern alone." In other words, if I have done something wrong, it's none of your business. But guess what? Job hasn't done anything wrong. He says, "If indeed you would exalt yourself above me and use my humiliation against me," then in verse 6, he says, "Then know this, God has wronged me." This is a direct accusation against God. God has drawn his net around me. And though I cry, "I have been wronged," I get no response. Job accuses God of being the one who is wicked. And he says, when I cry out for justice, when I try to take God to the table and hold him accountable, God is silent. He has not shown up to defend himself. He says, though I call for help, there is no justice. There's no restoration of the broken relationship that Job feels with God. Job accuses God of not acting correctly in his dealings with Job. He goes on in verse 8, he says, God has blocked my way so I cannot pass. God has shrouded my paths with darkness. It's not my own wicked ways, Bildad, like you just said. It is God himself who has driven me from the light into the darkness. He has stripped me of my honor and glory and removed the crown from my head. He tears me down on every side till I'm gone. He uproots my hope like a tree. His anger burns against me. He counts me among his enemies. His troops advance in force. They build a siege ramp against me and a camp around my tent. He has alienated my brothers from me. My acquaintances are completely estranged from me. My kinsmen have gone away. My friends have forgotten me. My guests and my maidservants count me a stranger. They look upon me as an alien. In other words, Bildad, you want to talk about a wicked person? Let's talk about God. For God is the one who's acting like the wicked man. God is the one who has stripped everything away. God is the one who has created such a loss. He says in verse 17, my breath is even offensive to my wife. Now, how many wives would agree that their husband's breaths are offensive? He says, I am loathsome to my brothers. Well, sure, Job, you're sitting in ashes. You've covered yourself with all kind of disgusting stuff to show that you are in remorse, that you are grieving for your losses. He goes on, he says, all my intimate friends, they detest me. Let's see, I could count 3 on my fingers. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Intimate friends, sure, they now detest me. And then in verse 21, he says, have pity on me, my friends, have pity. For the hand of God has struck me. Now what Job actually says here is, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, can't you be better than God? The hand of God has struck me down. Can't you be better and have pity on me? Why do you pursue me as God does? Will you never get enough of my flesh? Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, he says. And in verse 24 he says, that they would be inscribed with an iron tool on lead, or engraved in a rock forever. In other words, he says, my life is important. My experience is important. What I am going through is so important, it should be remembered. It should become authoritative. It should help other people who experience similar suffering. Now we come to Job's third transformation. At first, Job began to imagine that maybe someone could hear his argument. He didn't believe at that point, at that first stage, that there was anybody, but he began to imagine it. Then in his second transformation, Job states that there is somebody. He doesn't know who this person is. He's not related to this person, but somebody in heaven has to have seen all that Job has undergone and can speak on his behalf. Well, now, in verse 25 of chapter 19, Job reaches his third transformation of faith. So again, circle this, star it, underline it, highlight it. Job says in chapter 19, verse 25, I know my Redeemer lives. The Hebrew word for Redeemer is goel. It refers to a kinsman redeemer, to someone who is closely related to Job, who can not only speak on his behalf, but who can act to restore what was wrong. He says, I know my Redeemer, my Goel, lives. I haven't just imagined him. He's not just somebody way off in the distance. No, my Redeemer, he lives. And he is related to me. We have fellowship together. I have somebody on my side. Because I know my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand with me. He will stand upon the earth, upon the dust, upon that which I am made from. Now, before we go any further, we need to pause. Because as great of a statement as this is, it has a much deeper possible meaning. The word goel in the Hebrew, the word redeemer, can refer to a liberator, a deliverer, as in God, or as in our Savior Jesus Christ. Jesus is our Redeemer. He is our goel, our liberator, our deliverer from sin. The word could also mean defender or lawyer, someone who defends an innocent man who has been wrongly accused. So Job could be saying, not only do I have a deliverer, I have a lawyer who's on my side. A lawyer who's able to take God to court. A lawyer who can try the Almighty. But the word goes even further. The word could also mean avenger. Someone who not only is a liberator or a lawyer, but someone who is a warrior, who can bring to justice and complete the act of justice by avenging the wrong person and killing the abuser, the wicked man, the one who is in the wrong. So what does Job really say here when he says, I know my Redeemer lives? Does he say, I know someone will deliver me? Perhaps. Does he say, I know someone will listen to my argument and take my words to God? Perhaps. Or does Job also say, I know that my avenger lives, and my avenger will kill off this wicked God? In verse 26, Job says, after my skin has been destroyed. Now, the Hebrew actually says, after my skin has been flayed off. He says, yet in my flesh I will see God. And in verse 27, he says, I will see him with my own eyes. In other words, Job is saying, when my Goel shows up, when my deliverer, lawyer, and avenger does me right, I will be able to see God. I will be able to recreate God as I see him. I will kill off this awful, silent God, and I will know a God who is just and merciful, compassionate, feeling towards his creation. He says, if you say, how we will hound him, since the root of trouble lies in him. That's what Job's friends are doing. They're hounding him because they think he's a liar. He says, you, and he's talking to his three friends, you should fear the sword than yourself. For wrath will bring punishment by the sword, and then you will know that there is judgment. In other words, the anger of the God I will create when I see him, because my Redeemer lives, my Avenger lives. That God, you better watch out, because he's going to come after you. Now Zophar, the Naamite, speaks up in verse 20. He can't be silent. He says in verse 2, oh, my troubled thoughts prompt me to answer because I am greatly distressed. Now let me ask, be honest. Are you greatly distressed right now? Are you troubled with the thought that Job wants to kill God off and recreate God as he wants to see God? Does that trouble you? Does that distress you? If so, you can relate to what Zophar feels. Zophar is so troubled by Job's radical approach to faith. He says, I hear a rebuke that dishonors me, and surely my understanding inspires me to reply. So, Job, you've just offended me. You said you wanted to kill my God off. That's offensive to me. I can't stay silent. I've got to speak up. He says, surely you know how it has been from of old, ever since man was placed on the earth. You learned it in Sunday school, Job. You've learned it through every Sunday sermon you've heard since a child. That the mirth of the wicked is brief. The joy of the godless lasts only for a brief moment. And again, he goes on to say, though his pride reaches to the heavens and his head touches the clouds. And Job, isn't that what you want to do? You're saying your Redeemer lives, your Avenger lives. You want to go up to heaven. You want to take God out. You want to recreate God. You want to be God. There you go, Job. You've, in your pride, reached your head up to heaven. Even though you've done that, the wicked will perish forever like his own dung. Those who have seen him will say, "Where is this piece of horse hockey?" For like a dream he flies away, no more to be found, banished like a vision in the night. So he's saying, Job, again, no. Nobody's going to listen to you. Nobody's going to remember you because you're a piece of bleep. And this is why you are a wicked person. Why you are a bad man, Job. It's not just because you want to kill off God. It's not just because you want to recreate God with some new understanding. No, it is because in verse 19, he says, you have oppressed the poor. You have left them destitute. You have seized the homes of the poor, and you didn't build anything new for them. Verse 22, he says, in the midst of his plenty, distress will overtake him. The full force of his misery will come upon him. When he has filled his belly, which Job, you had done, you have filled your belly, God will then vent his burning anger against him and rain down his blows upon him. You say, Job, that God is abusing you? Well, it's because you deserve it, Job. You're a bad person. You don't treat people well. You steal from the poor. You take candy from babies, Job. This is why God is mad. This is why he's raining down his blows upon you. In verse 27, he says, the heavens will expose his guilt. The earth will rise up against him. A flood will carry off his house, rushing waters on the day of God's wrath. For such is the fate God allows the wicked, the heritage appointed to them by God. Job, you are a monster. And like all chaos monsters that tried to oppose God, you too will be destroyed. So Job replies in chapter 21. He says, now you listen carefully to my words, and let this be consolation to you. In other words, he's being sarcastic. He says, bear with me while I speak, and after I have spoken, well then mock on. So then he asks, is my complaint directed to a man? The answer is no, my complaint's to God. God, you're hurting me, and you're silent about it. Show up and do something. He says, look at me and be astonished. Clap your hand over your mouth. When I think about this, I'm terrified. Trembling seizes my body. Why do the wicked live on? So he says to his friends, you've been arguing the same type of belief that's in the book of Proverbs. A belief which I got to admit, I once held to as well. That the wicked only last for a short time. The righteous, they're the ones that survive and inherit the blessings. Now Job, he is arguing against such a belief. He says, now why do the wicked live on? And we see this today. Many of us wonder the same thing. We ask the same question. Why does bad things happen to good people? Why do those who choose sinful lifestyles seem to have it all, and nothing ever happens to them? Why do the wicked live on, growing old and increasing in their power? They see their children established around them, their offspring before their eyes. You accuse me of being wicked. Well, where's my children? The wicked have children. The wicked have offspring, but mine have been taken away. Their homes are safe and free from fear. My home's been destroyed, and I am terrified. The rod of God is not upon the wicked, but the rod of God is upon me. In verse 13, he says, they spend their years in prosperity and go down to the grave in peace. Yet they say to God, leave us alone. We have no desire to know your ways. Who is the Almighty that we should serve him? What would we gain by praying to him? He goes on in verse 16, he says, their prosperity is not in their own hands, so I stand aloof from the counsel of the wicked. I'm not part of that group. They prosper. Their family grows. God doesn't care what happens to them, but God surely has his eyes on me, and God has his rod upon me, so I must be something other than wicked. I must be something more, something different. I am upright and innocent. He says in verse 19, God stores up a man's punishment for his sons. Well, let him repay the man himself, so that he will know it. He says, God, if you've got a problem against me, take it out on me. Don't take away my kids. Don't take away my wife. Don't take away my friends. Don't take away my servants. Don't take away my community. Take it out on me, and me alone. Let his own eyes see his destruction. Let him drink the wrath of the Almighty. For what does he care about the family he leaves behind when his allotted months come to an end? He goes on, he says, can anyone teach knowledge to God since he judges even the highest? In other words, Job is basically saying, something's not right here. You know? If you're saying God punishes the wicked, why do the wicked prosper? And why do the righteous feel so awful? It says, one man dies in full vigor, completely secure and at ease. His body is well nourished, his bones rich in marrow. And another person dies in bitterness of soul, having never enjoyed anything. Side by side, they both lie in the dust, and worms cover them both. Now that is almost directly from the book of Ecclesiastes, which states that it doesn't matter whether you do good or do bad, you end up in the same place. You both die. He says, I know full well what you are thinking, the schemes by which you would wrong me. You say, where now is the great man's house, the tents that this wicked man had lived in? Well, have you never questioned those who travel? They don't take great houses with them. No, have you paid no regard to their accounts? That the evil man is spared from the day of calamity, that he is delivered from the day of wrath. In other words, Job argues that experience disproves retribution theology, that God punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous. Experience shows that belief to be incorrect. He says, who denounces his conduct to his face? Who repays him for what he has done? For he is carried to the grave. And watch is kept over his tomb. The soil in the valley is sweet to him. All men follow after him, and a countless throng goes before him. He says, what is all the point of all of this? What does it matter? We all end up in the grave. So how can you console me with your nonsense? For nothing is left of your lies, your falsehood. He says to his three friends, you can argue till you're blue in the face. You can stand up and you can shout from the hilltop as loud as you can. All the proverbs you want to state and profess, all the proverbs you believe in, all this retribution of God is going to bless the perfect person and God is going to destroy the beast. But it's all lies. It's all falsehood. And life itself proves your belief is wrong. For the wicked and the righteous both end up in the grave with worms covering them both. This ends Job's second round of arguments with his three friends. When we come back again in verse 22, we will enter the third and final round of arguments that Job will have with his three friends. God bless.